part of the Civil Rights Act applied to education. And it basically said any institution that receives federal monies cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. And that went into our institutions. That was 1972. A side story of this is that Congress passed it, but there was an individual that didn't want it to pass, so he threw in sports. And thank goodness for Patsy Mink of Hawaii in the House. She stood up in the House floor and fought for the vote to include sports within the Title IX legislation, and it applied to sports. Now, then there was this huge pushback from the NCAA and coaches. At the time, I was working with ABC, and I was testifying in Washington. I put together a lobby to support Title IX, and the football coaches would call ABC and say, you gotta fire her because she's working in Washington, what is she doing? She's disrupting the whole football establishment. Thank goodness we had the leaders we did on the Hill because they didn't waffle, and Senator Stevens was from Alaska, and the NCAA lobby couldn't really impact him. So the law passed. The law passed, but then athletic directors across the country were saying, well, I went to UCLA and they built Poly Pavilion where we had the greatest basketball teams in the world, but there was no women's locker room. This is going to bankrupt sports in America to have women rushing in. And by the way, women aren't interested in sports on the collegiate level. They just want to go to college to get married. And nobody's going to come watch women's collegiate basketball. Who cares? And so this is the debate, that was going on at the time. I did leave ABC, left television to go work on the Hill. And at the same time, we had the Amateur Sports Act, which is another thing. But we really had to pay attention to what was going on in the Hill because there was a great lobby to try to disentangle sports from the legislation. To make a long story short, under Reagan, there was a big push, it went to the Supreme Court, that challenged Title IX and how it applied to schools. And the first interpretation was only the program that receives federal dollars can we mandate equality. If the program doesn't receive federal dollars, that would mean you wouldn't have to abide by equality on campuses. Well, what happened was we went back under the Civil Rights Restoration Act and we passed Title IX, and we also came up with 3 ways you could apply the rule, because when you come up with a policy, you have to have ways in which you can apply it. And everybody realized that, yes, the funnel of sports on elite level, we couldn't overnight have equality. We had to have gradual ways in which these schools could comply so they wouldn't get in trouble. So up until about 15, 20 years ago, women had about 1/3 of the opportunities that men did. And then some of the parents got very smart and they said, well, most schools are not under compliance. We're going to go to the courts and we're going to start suing the schools individually. And that changed the paradigm a lot because schools were having to pay out all this money. So they started to get under compliance. But if you think about it, 1972 this law was passed and still most schools are under compliance. But however, you've seen how it's played out in our universities. Also, Title IX was passed because there were quotas for business school and law school at the time. Got away with quotas. So you know how many women have gone into law, medicine, and the business. So that's a quick explanation. But if you talk about universally, if you don't, you have policy, but you have to have a way to implement policy, and that's the real lesson here. Thank you.